Greetings, Wanderer, and welcome back to Yindy's Tips and Tricks. Continuing on from our last video where I explained what D&D and TTRPGs were in general, I thought it best to compile a video of useful tips and tricks for new players trying to break into this quirky little hobby of ours. I plan on making separate videos. 5 things for new players joining the first D&D/TTRPG game, as well as 5 things for new dungeon masters putting together their first adventure. But first, let's start with 5 things that apply to both players and dungeon masters alike. Making sure that your first game runs smoothly, and getting you in the right headspace for your first session. So let's begin. 1. This isn't a video game, and you're not the main character. I can already hear a chorus of veteran D&D players crying out in thanks. Because main character syndrome is probably the single biggest thing that tanks a D&D session. Let me explain. So let's say you're a veteran Skyrim player. Or perhaps you found D&D through something like Baldur's Gate 3. Or another TTRPG inspired video game. You get invited over to your friend's house to join their ongoing campaign, where you can't wait to play your half-dragonborn rogue warrior mage hybrid called Gary Lou. You've written an elaborate backstory over the past week and sent it to the DM. A tale about how you're secretly the long-lost heir to the throne, and how you're actually the coolest, most powerful, badass character ever. But then, none of it seems to come up in the session. Outside of a few introductory scenes where you get introduced to the party, this story doesn't seem about you at all. Worse still, your plan to burn down the orphanage as petty revenge against that NPC who beat you in a card game has been met with skepticism by the rest of the party, and they've voted it down. Not to mention that bit in your backstory where the mage is secretly in love with you and wants to kiss your face. No, apparently that's making people uncomfortable. We all have our D&D horror stories about that one player, or perhaps even DM, that derails an entire session by hogging the spotlight, stealing the attention, and throwing a hissy fit whenever it's not all about them. We call this main character syndrome, and it might be the single biggest source of conflict at any D&D table. So what to do and how to avoid it? Remember, this is a co-op narrative-driven game. No one person is the main character. Not one of the players, and not the DM's favourite NPC. Think of Game of Thrones. You might have thought that Ned Stark was the main character right up to the end of Season 1 where he got his head chopped off. Oh yeah, spoiler alert for a 14-year-old TV show. But then you realise it's an ensemble cast, with multiple point-of-view characters, each with their own unique stories to tell. That's how you should think of your own D&D group. Although I'm not saying that you shouldn't take the spotlight when it's your time to shine. A good DM and group should recognise that sneaking into a nobleman's private quarters and picking the lock on his desk, probably a job for the rogue, and not the paladin in full plate armour and moral compass. Similarly, if the DM has incorporated some elements of your backstory into the scene to give you your opportunity to shine, the other players should respect that, as you should when it's their turn. It's all about balance and making sure that everybody's got their turn in the spotlight. Oh, and DMs, it's your responsibility to make sure that every player gets their moment. If you notice that one quiet player that hasn't had much to do in a few sessions, throw them a bone. Give them a challenge that's uniquely suited to their skill set. Or perhaps a story beat that ties in with their character's backstory. Oh, and DMs, you're not the main character either. You control everything but the player's actions. They're the wild card, the one thing you can't anticipate, and they will set fire to all your carefully laid plans. But that's part of the game. If you want to dictate everything, go write a book instead. 2. Learn to embrace failure and adapt. That's part of the fun. Leading on from my earlier point. Remember how in my last video I said that 95% of D&D boils down to your character goes to try something, you roll a dice, add a number. If you roll high enough, you succeed. And the story continues. However, roll badly, you mess up. Something unexpected happens, but most crucially of all, the story still continues. We're all used to save scumming in games. Be honest with me. How many times have you loaded up that save in Baldur's Gate 3 to get that nat 20 persuasion check? Or perhaps you quick loaded because you broke your last lockpick on Skyrim. Now, that's fine for a single player game, but TTRPGs are an evolving narrative. If you roll, fumble, and fail, that's part of the story now. Think of it as a great TV show moment. Remember how in Halfwits, Bernard challenged Will to a bard-off, only to roll a nat 1 on his performance check and faceplant there and then in front of the crowd? That's hilarious! Roll with it, it's part of the story now. But don't try and bully the DM or the other players to force your idea through. If it didn't work, and you messed up, pass the torch to another player and give them a go. Oh, and DMs, the reverse is also true. Eventually that one player will come up with that absolutely ridiculous plan that shouldn't have a snowflake's chance in hell of working, yet manages to roll a nat 20. That's awesome! Give them that moment, even if it's not what you initially intended. Don't worry, we can always introduce unintended consequences later. 3. You don't need to memorize all the rules. I touched on this in my last video, but it's worth repeating. All the core rule books, source books, campaign supplements, they're all optional. A lot of new players, and especially new GMs, may feel an overwhelming pressure to memorize every single rule for every given situation. But the truth is, you don't have to. Oh yeah, confession time. I've never actually read one of my rule books cover to cover. I just flick through it and pull out the relevant bits that I need for that session. As a new GM, you may feel that it's your job to teach everyone the game. And while this may somewhat be true, especially if you're dealing with a completely new group of players, your job is to guide them, not overload them. If they're just getting their head around the basics, don't weigh them down with rules for travel time, spell preparation, crafting, mounted combat and dragon training all in their first session. And give the party a situation to apply those mechanics before gradually increasing the complexity of the game. Think of it like a video game tutorial. Start simple and build out from there. Also, DMs, if you're playing with more experienced players who enjoy theory crafting, character building, and more crunchier rule sets like Pathfinder, trust them to handle their side of the game. You don't need to run everything. For example, in my Pathfinder home game, which for those of you who don't know are a more rules-heavy, crunchier version of D&D, I designated one of my players as a trusted player. This means that they could help the rest of the party out with things like character builds, crafting, loot distribution, and micromanaging the player side of things. That freed me up to focus on the monsters, dungeon, and overall story, without getting bogged down with the nitty-gritty of player mechanics, and helped the game just run smoother from week to week. 4. Manage expectations as a DM, and understand what game you're joining as a player. Feeding on from my last point. Every D&D group is different. If I invite some of my more casual friends over for a light-hearted, informal, in-person game, I'm going to keep the session rules light. I'll focus on teaching them the core mechanics, without overwhelming them with crunchy rules, keeping the tone light-hearted, and serving as a general vehicle for the silliness, banter, and dad jokes. However, if I'm playing with veteran players who enjoy build and theory crafting, and just want to test out their character's new skills, abilities, and magic items against a super tough boss in a mega dungeon, well, that's a completely different experience. I won't waste my time role-playing every single shopkeeper interaction, and while there is still plenty banter and silliness, the comedy tends to come more from the players applying the rules in new, creative, and unexpected ways. Both playstyles are equally valid, and I do enjoy DMing both. However, it should be fairly obvious that the hardcore mid-max player might get frustrated at the beginner-friendly table where the bard spends 20 minutes trying to seduce the bartender to try and get free drinks. Likewise, a new casual player might feel a little bit overwhelmed being thrown into level 16 of a mega dungeon with a team of crack adventurers armed to the teeth with exotic weapons and with meticulously organised battle strategies. Basically, know what type of game you're joining, and don't try and force your preferred playstyle on the rest of the party who may not enjoy it. Going back to point 1, it's not all about you. To all the DMs, yes, Session 0 can sort a lot of this out. However, let's face it, life happens, schedules change, and it's more than likely that halfway through a campaign, it might be necessary to recruit a new player who wasn't there for Session 0. Sometimes you just need to make the tough call on whether or not a player is the right fit for the group. I've had to knock back experienced players before because I knew they would overshadow and railroad less experienced players and disrupt the group dynamics. Likewise, I've had to knock back lovely, eager newbies because the game they were trying to join would likely be too intimidating and potentially ruin their first TTRPG experience. Basically, get the right people for the right game. Number 5. Communication and feedback is vital. And that brings us to our final point. Communication, which is essential to the long-term health of the game, the friendships, and relationships within the group. If something isn't working, and one of the players or the DM isn't having fun, then you need to ask yourself why. And then bring it up with that person in a non-confrontational way. These are basic human social skills. Scary, I know, but if handled correctly, can actually sharpen real-life conflict resolution skills. And this is how we grow as both players and DMs. Most of the time, this can be resolved by simply discussing the matter, or a simple rules tweak, or maybe even just clarifying why something is the way it is. However, on those rare occasions where the situation is actually bigger than that, there's actually nothing wrong with saying, look, thanks guys, but this particular game isn't for me, and then going off and finding a new group. I've stepped away from multiple games before as a player, not because I didn't like the people, but because I wasn't a good fit for that particular game. And at the end of the day, I wasn't having fun. I've also turned down plenty of professional DMing gigs for the exact same reason. If it's not working, be honest with yourself and your players. Bonus. Always thank your DM as a player, and always thank your players as the DM. Okay, for 99% of people this one's a given, but I've actually begun to see a worrying pushback online of people making arguments like, well, that's their job. If they don't like it, then they shouldn't be DMing. Okay, I've seen this sentiment a few times online, and I think the only correct response is you. If that's your mindset, you're probably not a fun person to play with, and I probably would have kicked you from my group long before it became an issue. Okay, so let's break this down. This argument tends to pop up the most when discussing professional DMing or pay-to-play games where there is some nuance. I do plan on doing a video discussing the differences between professional DMing and running a private home game. TLDR, if you're paying for a game, you're paying for a D&D experience. If money has changed hands, I have a much higher expectation of a pro DM than I do of my mate who's running a casual home game. Again, it all comes back to know what type of game you're joining, but we'll save that discussion for another video. That said, I have seen this same argument applied to home games, to which my response is, don't be a dick. As a player, in most cases, all you need to do is show up and have fun. And outside of leveling up and managing your character sheet, there's really nothing you need to do in between sessions. DMs, on the other hand, have to host, plan ahead, manage resources, read ahead and prep for pre-written adventures or world build from scratch. Now, a lot of DMs do enjoy this, but that doesn't mean it's not work. There's a reason why it's harder to find DMs willing to give up the time so that you can play. And why many experienced GMs actually offer their services professionally. And DMs, don't take your players for granted either. Thank them for being there, for their friendship, and for the opportunity to play together and have fun. So, always thank your DM for a good session, if for no other reason than it's just a polite thing to do. Well, that's all I got. If you'd like to see me DM, why not check out the 4 Halfwits Supercut, out now on YouTube? And if you'd like to catch episode 11 1 week early, it's currently out now on our Patreon. Like and subscribe if you found this video useful, and hopefully it helps you build or find your own long-lasting TTRPG group. If you'd like me to run a D&D game for you, hit me up at startplaying.games and I'll see what I can do. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Yindy, out.